The morning air felt cold as David walked through the busy streets of New Terra Colony. He pulled his jacket tighter and checked his watch. The Interspecies Center auction would start in 30 minutes, and he didn't want to be late. Not because he planned to buy anything, but because his research needed this information. David worked as a scientist who studied different alien species. For 3 years, he had been trying to understand how these beings behaved and what made them tick. The monthly auctions were perfect for his research. He could observe dozens of different species in one place and take notes about their reactions to stress. The Interspecies Center stood like a giant gray box in the middle of the colony. People called it many things, but officially, it was a place where displaced aliens got help finding new homes and jobs. David knew the reality was more complicated than that pretty description. Inside the building, the auction hall buzzed with activity. About 200 people filled the metal chairs, most of them business owners looking for workers. The air smelled like disinfectant and nervous sweat. David found a seat in the back row where he could see everything clearly. The auctioneer, a tall man with a permanent frown, stepped up to the microphone. His voice echoed through the speakers as he explained the rules. Each alien had been evaluated and given ratings for different skills. Buyers could examine the paperwork before making their bids. David pulled out his notebook and started writing. He watched as the first group was brought onto the stage. These were Zephyrians, tall blue beings known for their strength. The bidding was quick and aggressive. Construction companies wanted them for heavy lifting work. Next came a group of small, green pixelings. Their tiny hands made them perfect for detailed electronic work. Tech companies bid against each other until the prices got surprisingly high. David wrote down everything, noting how different species were valued for different abilities. The auction continued for 2 hours. Beings of all shapes and sizes crossed the stage. Some looked scared, others appeared angry, and a few seemed completely blank, like they had given up hope entirely. David felt uncomfortable watching it all, but told himself this was just research. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd began to thin out. Many buyers had found what they needed and left. The auctioneer looked tired, and his assistant kept checking the time. Only about 50 people remained in the seats. "Now we come to our final presentation of the day," the auctioneer announced. His voice carried a hint of frustration that David caught immediately. 2 Etherian females, ages estimated at 22 and 24 in human years. 2 figures were led onto the stage, and David looked up from his notes. Etherians were rare. He had only seen pictures in scientific journals. These were the first live ones he had ever encountered. The first girl was small and delicate. Her skin had a blue tint that seemed to shimmer under the bright lights. Strange patterns moved across her arms and face like living tattoos. She kept her head down and her shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make herself invisible. The second girl stood taller and straighter. Her skin was darker blue with silver markings that flashed and pulsed. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning the crowd and the exits. Everything about her posture screamed defiance and barely controlled energy. "Let me be honest with you folks," the auctioneer said, shuffling through his papers. "These 2 have been with us for quite some time. They have proven challenging to place." David leaned forward in his seat. This was interesting from a research perspective. What made these particular aliens so difficult to place when others had been snapped up quickly? The auctioneer continued reading from his clipboard. Subject designation L447, the smaller one, has been classified as unsuitable for standard labor assignments. She becomes physically ill under normal work stress. Previous placements report excessive emotional reactions and inability to follow basic commands without breaking down. The small blue girl seemed to shrink even more at these words. David noticed. Her strange skin patterns were moving faster now, swirling in what looked like distressed waves. Subject designation N891, the taller one, has attempted escape from 3 separate facilities. She shows aggressive tendencies and refuses to accept authority. Previous supervisors report that she disrupts other workers and creates security risks. The taller girl's silver markings flashed brighter, and she lifted her chin higher. David could see the anger in her posture, but underneath it, he sensed something else. Pain, maybe, or deep disappointment. "Now, I know what you're thinking," the auctioneer said with a forced laugh. "But we're prepared to offer very competitive pricing on these two. They do come with basic language programming and have been medically cleared." David looked around the auction hall. The remaining buyers were studying their phones or having quiet conversations. Nobody seemed interested in the two Etherean girls on the stage. "Let's start the bidding at 500 credits for the pair," the auctioneer announced. Silence filled the room. David counted 10 seconds, then 15. The auctioneer's smile became strained. "Perhaps 400 credits?" He tried again. More silence. David watched the two girls. The smaller one had started trembling slightly. The taller one's markings were now flashing in rapid, angry bursts. 300 credits for both subjects? The auctioneer's voice cracked, slightly. A man in the third row raised his hand, then immediately lowered it when his companion whispered something urgent in his ear. David saw several people shake their heads and look away. 200 credits? The auctioneer was now sweating despite the cool air in the hall. Nobody moved. David felt a strange tension building in his chest as he watched this scene unfold. In all his months of research, he had never seen an auction fail completely. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer said, clearing his throat, "if we cannot find placement for these subjects today, they will be transferred to the Outer Rim facilities for basic labor assignments." David knew what that meant. The Outer Rim facilities were essentially work camps where aliens did dangerous mining and construction jobs. The conditions were harsh and many didn't survive long. The smaller blue girl looked up for the first time, and David saw her face clearly. Her eyes were large and dark, filled with terror and resignation. The taller girl had gone completely still, her markings dim now except for a steady pulse at her temples. "Going once for 200 credits, the auctioneer called out desperately. David felt his notebook slip from his fingers. Those eyes. The smaller girl's eyes reminded him of something from his past. During his military service years ago, he had worked as a medic. He remembered wounded soldiers with that same look of hopeless fear, going twice for 200 credits. The room felt frozen in time. David could hear his own heartbeat. He thought about his comfortable life, his quiet research lab, his simple routines. He thought about those work camps on the Outer Rim and what would happen to these two beings. Something moved in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't scientific curiosity or research interest. It was something much more basic and human. Final call. 200 credits for both subjects or they transfer to Outer Rim assignment. David's hand moved before his brain could stop it. His arm went up, holding his identification card. "We have a bid," the auctioneer shouted with obvious relief. 200 credits to bidder 779. The room turned to look at David. He felt dozens of eyes on him, some curious, others surprised. A few people looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Any other bids?" the auctioneer asked, though his tone suggested he didn't expect any. Nobody else moved. "Sold to bidder 779 for 200 credits. David sat in his chair, suddenly realizing what he had just done. He had come here to take notes for his research. Now he was responsible for two alien beings that nobody else wanted. His simple, quiet life had just become very complicated. As people filed out of the auction hall, David made his way to the processing desk. His hands shook slightly as he filled out the paperwork and transferred the credits. The whole process felt surreal, like he was watching someone else do it. 20 minutes later, he stood in the pickup area waiting for his, what were they exactly? His purchases? That word felt wrong. His responsibility? That seemed more accurate but still incomplete. When they brought the two Etherean girls out, they looked even smaller and more vulnerable than they had on stage. Someone had given them simple gray clothing and small bags with their few belongings. David looked at them, and they looked back at him. None of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, David cleared his throat. "My name is David," he said quietly. "I have a place outside the city where you can stay. It's safe, and there's plenty of space." The smaller girl's patterns shifted to a softer blue. The taller one studied his face with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Why?" the taller one asked. Her voice was clear but had an unusual musical quality. David thought about that question. Why had he raised his hand? Why had he changed his entire life in a single moment? "Because everyone deserves a chance," he said finally. "And because nobody else saw what I saw up there." "What did you see?" the smaller girl whispered. David smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt in months. "I saw two people who needed help. And maybe, just maybe, I saw two people who could help me understand that there's more to life than just..." The drive to David's home took 40 minutes through winding roads that led away from the busy colony center. The two Etherian girls sat quietly in the back seat of his transport vehicle, their small bags clutched tightly in their hands. David kept glancing in the mirror, wondering what they were thinking. His research facility sat on 20 acres of land surrounded by natural forest. The main building housed his laboratory and living quarters, while several smaller structures contained his experimental gardens and equipment storage. It was peaceful here, far from the noise and chaos of the colony. As they pulled up to the house, David felt nervous butterflies in his stomach. He had lived alone for 5 years, ever since his divorce. His ex-wife had always said he cared more about his plants and research than people. Maybe she was right. What did he know about taking care of anyone, especially two alien beings who had been through terrible experiences? "This is home," David said as he opened the vehicle doors. "At least it's my home. I hope it can be yours too for as long as you need." The smaller girl stepped out first, her eyes wide as she looked around. Her skin patterns shifted to lighter blues and greens as she noticed his gardens. The taller girl emerged more cautiously, her silver markings dim but alert, scanning for potential threats or escape routes. "What are your names?" David asked gently. "I mean, what do you want me to call you?" The smaller girl spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am called Lyra in your language. The sounds are close enough to my real name." The taller girl studied David for a moment before answering. "Nova. My name means bright star in the old tongue of my people." David nodded. "Lyra and Nova. Beautiful names. Come on, let me show you around." The house was larger than it looked from outside. David had converted most of it into research space, but there were still 2 empty bedrooms that he hadn't used in years. As they walked through the rooms, Lyra stayed close to the windows, drawn to the gardens visible outside. Nova examined doorways and windows with the eye of someone always planning an escape. "You can each have your own room," David explained, opening the doors to show them the bedrooms. "There are locks on the inside if you want privacy. The bathroom is down the hall and the kitchen is downstairs. You're free to eat whatever you find there." Nova frowned. "What do you want from us?" The question caught David off guard. "What do you mean?" "Everyone wants something," Nova said, her markings flashing briefly. "The people at the centers, the previous families who took us in. They all wanted us to do something specific. Work in their businesses, clean their houses, be quiet and invisible." "What's your plan?" David sat down on the edge of a chair, trying to look less intimidating. "Honestly, I don't have a plan. I saw what was about to happen to you at that auction, and I couldn't let it happen. Beyond that, I'm making this up as I go along." Lyra had moved to the window and was staring out at the experimental gardens. Her patterns were moving in slow, peaceful waves now. "Your plants," she said softly. "They're in pain." "What?" David stood up quickly. "Which ones? I check them every day for diseases and problems." "Not sick pain," Lyra explained, turning to face him. "Emotional pain. They're lonely, confused. They don't understand what you want from them." David stared at her. In all his years of botanical research, he had never heard anyone describe plants that way. "How can you tell?" Lyra's cheeks flushed a deeper blue. "I just can. I always could, even as a child. It's why they said I was too sensitive. I feel what living things feel." Nova moved protectively closer to Lyra. That's why she got sick at the workplaces. Too many angry, frustrated people around her all the time. She absorbs their emotions like a sponge. This was fascinating from a scientific perspective, but David could see it was also painful for Lyra to talk about. "Would you like to see the gardens?" he asked gently. "Maybe you could help me understand what they need." For the first time since they'd met, Lyra smiled. It transformed her entire face, making her look younger and more hopeful. The next few days established a strange new routine. David quickly learned that his old ways of living wouldn't work anymore. Lyra needed quiet spaces and time alone to recover from the overwhelming emotions she constantly picked up from others. Nova needed clear boundaries and the freedom to move around without feeling trapped. The first major challenge came on their third night. David woke up around 2 in the morning to strange sounds coming from downstairs. He crept down quietly and found Nova in his laboratory, carefully examining his research equipment. "Planning to break it?" David asked softly, trying not to startle. Her Nova spun around, her markings flashing bright silver in defense mode. "I wasn't stealing anything." "I didn't say you were." David stepped into the room slowly, hands visible. "What were you looking at?" Nova hesitated, then pointed to his computer setup. "Your security system. It's terrible. Anyone could break in here within minutes. Your perimeter sensors are outdated, and you have blind spots all around the eastern side of the property." David blinked in surprise. "How do you know about security systems?" "I pay attention," Nova said defensively. "Every place we've been, I study how things work. How to get in, how to get out, what weaknesses exist. It keeps us alive." Instead of being angry, David felt impressed. "Could you show me what you found?" For the next hour, Nova walked him through every security flaw in his setup. Her knowledge was incredible. She understood not just the technical aspects, but also human behavior patterns, blind spots in surveillance, and strategic thinking that would make military commanders jealous. "Why are you telling me this?" David asked when she finished. Nova was quiet for a moment. "Because you haven't tried to change us yet. Everyone else always wanted to fix us, make us different. You just let us be ourselves." The breakthrough with Lyra came a few days later. David was working in his greenhouse, frustrated because his experimental flowering plants were dying despite perfect growing conditions. He had tried everything he could think of, but they kept wilting and losing their blooms. Lyra appeared in the doorway, drawn by his obvious distress. "May I?" she asked. Gesturing toward the plants, David stepped back and watched as Lyra approached the flowering section. She didn't touch the plants, but her skin patterns began shifting and flowing in complex waves. She stood there for several minutes, completely still except for the mesmerizing dance of colors across her skin. "They're confused about the seasons," she said finally. "Your artificial lighting tries to mimic summer, but the temperature cycles feel like spring. They don't know when to bloom." David checked his environmental controls. Everything seemed normal to him, but he trusted Lyra's instincts. He adjusted the temperature programming to match the light cycles more closely. Within 2 days, the plants were thriving. Buds that had been closed for weeks suddenly burst into brilliant flowers. David's greenhouse transformed into a paradise of colors and scents. "How did you know?" he asked Lyra as they stood together admiring the results. "I felt their confusion," she explained. "Living things have emotions just like people do. Plants feel safe or scared, comfortable or stressed. They want to grow and be healthy, but sometimes they need help understanding what's expected of them." David realized that Lyra wasn't just sensitive to emotions. She was incredibly intelligent about life and growth. Her insights could revolutionize botanical research if she was willing to share them. Meanwhile, Nova had started making improvements to his security system without being asked. She rewired sensors, repositioned cameras, and created alert systems that David hadn't even known were possible with his equipment. When he asked her about it, she simply said she wanted their new home to be safe. As the weeks passed, David began to understand that the auction house had been completely wrong about both girls. Lyra wasn't too soft. She had a rare gift for understanding and communicating with living systems. Nova wasn't too wild. She was a natural protector and strategist whose skills had been wasted in meaningless jobs. But their peaceful new life was about to face its first real test. A month after their arrival, David received an official notice that made his blood run cold. Inspector Collins from the Colonial Authority would be visiting in 2 weeks to evaluate the success of the placement. David knew that Collins had a reputation for being strict and by the book. She believed that aliens needed firm discipline and clear structure to integrate properly into colonial society. If she saw Lyra and Nova living comfortably and being treated as equals rather than workers, she might decide the placement was a failure. As he read the notice, David realized that his simple act of kindness at the auction had gotten them all into something much more complicated than he had imagined. The three of them had found something special together, a kind of family that worked despite being made up of completely different species. But now they would have to prove to the authorities that their way of living was not just acceptable, but successful. Looking at Lyra tending to the plants and Nova checking the security monitors, David felt a fierce protectiveness he had never experienced before. These weren't just research subjects or charity cases. They had become his family, and he would fight to keep them safe. The real challenge was just beginning. David stared at the official notice for the third time that morning, hoping the words would somehow change. Inspector Collins would arrive in exactly 10 days to evaluate whether Lyra and Nova were being properly prepared for colonial life. The Maid letter made it clear that she expected to see measurable progress in their behavior and work skills. He found Lyra in the greenhouse, sitting quietly among the flowering plants that now bloomed more beautifully than ever before. Her skin patterns moved in gentle waves as she communicated with them in ways David was still trying to understand. "We need to talk," David said softly, not wanting to startle her. Lyra looked up with those large, expressive eyes. "You're worried. I can feel it from here." David sat down beside her on the wooden bench he had built. "The Colonial Authority is sending someone to check on how you and Nova are doing. Her name is Inspector Collins, and she has very specific ideas about how aliens should behave in our society." "What kind of ideas?" Lyra's patterns shifted to darker blues, reflecting her growing anxiety. She believes aliens need strict rules and constant supervision. She thinks you should be working in factories or cleaning services, following orders without question. She won't understand what we have here. Nova appeared in the greenhouse doorway, as if she had sensed the serious conversation. Her silver markings were dim, which David had learned meant she was in full listening mode. "How much trouble are we in?" Nova asked directly. David sighed. "If Inspector Collins decides that I haven't been preparing you properly for colonial integration, she can remove you both and place you in a stricter facility. Or worse, send you to those work camps I mentioned." The three of them sat in heavy silence for a moment. The beautiful plants around them seemed to droop slightly, as if they too could sense the fear in the air. "What if we pretend?" Lyra asked quietly. "What if we act the way she expects when she visits?" David had considered this option, but he shook his head. "I tried to coach some ideas yesterday, remember? You got physically sick just thinking about suppressing your natural abilities. And Nova, you looked miserable when I suggested you should appear more submissive." Nova's markings flashed briefly in agreement. "I won't pretend to be weak or stupid. I've done that before and it nearly broke me." "Then we need a different approach," David said, feeling a spark of determination. "Instead of hiding who you really are, we're going to show Inspector Collins exactly how valuable you both are to this colony." Over the next week, David worked harder than he had in years. He documented everything Lyra and Nova had accomplished since arriving at his facility. He took detailed photos of the greenhouse before and after Lyra's help. He recorded measurements showing how crop yields had improved by 40% in areas where she provided guidance. For Nova, he compiled security reports showing how her improvements had already prevented 2 potential break-ins and caught 3 system failures before they could cause damage. He reached out to other researchers in the colony who had heard about his work and invited them to visit. Dr. Rachel Kim from the medical center was the first to respond. She had been struggling with a mysterious illness affecting the colony's food crops. Traditional treatments weren't working and people were starting to worry about food shortages. When Dr. Kim arrived at David's facility, she looked skeptical. She was a serious woman who didn't believe in anything that couldn't be measured and proven scientifically. "I understand you have an alien who claims to communicate with plants," she said as David led her to the greenhouse. "Not claims," David corrected gently. "She actually does it. Let me show you." They found Lyra working with a section of tomato plants that had been struggling with some kind of stress condition. As Dr. Kim watched, Lyra placed her hands near the plants without touching them. Her skin patterns began flowing in complex spirals of green and gold. "They're afraid," Lyra said softly, her eyes closed in concentration. "Something in the soil is wrong, but not poison. It's old pain. These plants remember when this soil was hurt," Dr. Kim frowned. "What does that mean?" David had learned to trust Lyra's insights, even when they sounded strange. He took soil samples from the area and ran them through his analysis equipment. What he found surprised everyone. "There are trace minerals here that suggest this soil was contaminated years ago," David explained, showing Dr. Kim the results. "The contamination was cleaned up, but the mineral balance was never properly restored. The plants can sense that something is still not right." Dr. Kim stared at the data. How could she possibly know that without any equipment? "She feels what they feel," David said simply. "And she understands what they need to be healthy again." Working together, they developed a soil treatment plan based on Lyra's insights. Within days, the struggling plants began to recover. Dr. Kim was amazed by the results and asked if Lyra could help with the colony's crop problem. The solution to the food crop illness came from an unexpected direction. Lyra discovered that the problem wasn't in the plants themselves, but in their relationship with the beneficial insects that helped them grow. Chemical pesticides had disrupted the natural communication between plants and their insect partners. "The plants are calling for help, but their friends can't hear them anymore," Lyra explained to Dr. Kim. "We need to help them remember how to talk to each other." The treatment plan they developed was completely natural and cost almost nothing to implement. Within 2 weeks, the crop illness was completely eliminated. Dr. Kim was so impressed that she asked David to document everything for publication in the Colonial Medical Journal. Meanwhile, Nova's security expertise caught the attention of Chief Rodriguez from the colony's Defense Department. He had heard rumors about improvements to David's facility and wanted to see them for himself. Nova gave Chief Rodriguez a complete tour of her security upgrades, explaining each improvement and why it was necessary. Her knowledge impressed him, so much that he asked her to evaluate the colony's main security systems. "Most of our equipment is 10 years old," Chief Rodriguez admitted, as Nova pointed out weaknesses in their perimeter defenses. "We've been asking for budget increases, but the administrators don't understand why we need updates." Nova created a detailed report showing exactly how raiders or hostile wildlife could penetrate the colony's defenses. Her analysis was so thorough and accurate that Chief Rodriguez immediately requested permission to implement her recommendations. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked Nova as they reviewed her security plans. "I had to," Nova replied simply. "When you're always in danger, you learn to see every weakness and every strength. It's how you stay alive." Word began to spread throughout the colony about the amazing abilities of David's 2 residents. Scientists came to consult with Lyra about plant problems they couldn't solve. Security personnel asked Nova for advice on protecting important facilities. But not everyone was happy about these developments. Some colonists believed that aliens should stick to simple manual labor and not be trusted with important responsibilities. They complained to the colonial authority that David was giving his aliens too much freedom and authority. These complaints reached Inspector Collins just days before her scheduled visit. Instead of a routine evaluation, her inspection had now become a formal review with serious implications. 3 days before the inspector's arrival, David received another visitor who changed everything. Dr. Helen Torres, a specialist in Etherian culture, had traveled from the Central Colonies specifically to meet Lyra and Nova. "I've been studying your species for 20 years," Dr. Torres told them as they sat in David's living room. What you've accomplished here is extraordinary, but it's also completely natural for Etherians. She explained that in Etherian society, individuals like Lyra and Nova would be considered highly gifted. Lyra's empathic abilities would mark her as a potential healer and environmental guardian. Nova's strategic mind and protective instincts would identify her as leadership material. The auction system completely misunderstood your nature, Dr. Torres said. They saw your greatest strengths as flaws because they were trying to force you into roles that went against everything your species values. What do you mean? David asked. Etherians believe that harmony with living systems is sacred, Doctor. Torres explained. They also believe that true strength comes from protecting others, not dominating them. Lyra and Nova were never too soft or too wild. They were simply being true to their deepest nature. As Inspector Collins's visit approached, David felt more confident than he had in weeks. He had proof that Lyra and Nova weren't just successful, they were contributing to the colony in ways that no one had imagined possible. But he also knew that Inspector Collins was known for her rigid thinking and distrust of unconventional approaches. The next few days would determine whether their small family could stay together, or whether everything they had built would be torn apart by someone who couldn't see past her own narrow definitions of success. The morning of the inspection dawned, clear and bright. David stood at his window, watching Lyra tend to the gardens while Nova checked the security systems one final time. Whatever happened next, he knew that these two remarkable beings had already changed his life forever. Now it was time to show the world what he had always seen in them. Not problems to be fixed, but... Inspector Collins arrived exactly at 9 in the morning, stepping out of her official transport vehicle with a rigid posture that immediately put everyone on edge. She was a tall woman with sharp features and cold gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Behind her came 2 assistants carrying electronic tablets and recording equipment. David met them at the front entrance, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. Inspector Collins, welcome to my research facility. I'm David Chen, and I'm honored to have you here. Mr. Chen, she replied with a curt nod. I trust you understand the seriousness of this evaluation. The Colonial Authority has received complaints about your unconventional methods with the Etherian subjects. I prefer to think of them as Lyra and Nova, David said carefully. They're individuals with names and personalities, not just case numbers. Inspector Collins made a note on her tablet. That attitude is precisely what concerns us. Emotional attachment can cloud professional judgment. Where are the subjects now? David felt his jaw tighten at her clinical language, but he forced himself to stay calm. They're in the greenhouse working on a project that has already benefited the entire colony. As they walked toward the greenhouse, David tried to explain the improvements Lyra had made to his research, but Inspector Collins barely listened. She was more interested in examining the living quarters and checking whether proper security measures were in place. These bedrooms have locks on the inside, she observed with disapproval. Subjects should not have the ability to restrict access to their quarters. They're not prisoners, David replied. They're residents who deserve privacy and dignity. They're aliens under rehabilitation supervision, Inspector Collins corrected sharply. Privacy is a privilege that must be earned through demonstrated compliance. In the greenhouse, they found Lyra working with a new section of experimental plants. Her skin patterns were flowing in beautiful waves of green and gold as she communicated with the growing systems. The results were undeniable. Plants that had been struggling for months were now thriving beyond anything David had achieved before. Subject L447, Inspector Collins said loudly, causing Lyra to startle and lose her concentration. Step away from the plants and stand for inspection. Lyra's patterns immediately shifted to distressed blues and purples. She looked to David with confusion and fear, not understanding why this stranger was treating her so harshly. Inspector, please, David intervened. Her name is Lyra, and she's in the middle of delicate work that requires concentration. I will address the subjects as I see fit, Inspector Collins snapped. Subject L447, I said step away from the plants. As Lyra reluctantly moved away from her work, David could see her becoming physically ill from the inspector's hostile emotions. Her gift for feeling what others felt was working against her now, as she absorbed Inspector Collins's coldness and disapproval. Nova appeared in the greenhouse doorway, drawn by the tension. Her silver markings were flashing in defensive patterns, as she assessed the threat these strangers might pose. "Ah, Subject N891, Inspector Collins said, turning her attention to Nova. "I see you still display aggressive posturing. This is exactly the kind of behavior that needs correction." "She's not being aggressive," David said firmly. "She's being protective. There's a difference." "Mr. Chen, I strongly advise you not to argue with my professional assessment," Inspector Collins warned. "Your emotional attachment to these subjects is clearly affecting your judgment." For the next 2 hours, Inspector Collins put Lyra and Nova through a series of tests designed to measure their compliance and work readiness. She criticized Lyra's gentle nature as weakness and Nova's intelligence as dangerous independence. Everything that made them special was twisted into evidence of failure. The worst moment came when Inspector Collins demanded that Lyra demonstrate her plant abilities on command, like a trained animal performing tricks. When Lyra tried to explain that her connection with living things required calm and trust, the inspector marked it down as refusal to follow direct orders. By afternoon, David could see that both girls were exhausted and demoralized. Lyra was pale and trembling from absorbing hours of negative emotions. Nova's markings had gone dim except for occasional angry flashes when Inspector Collins was particularly harsh. "This evaluation is going exactly as I expected," Inspector Collins told David as her assistants packed up their equipment. "These subjects show no meaningful progress toward proper integration. If anything, your permissive approach has made their problematic behaviors worse." "That's not true," David protested. "You haven't seen what they've actually accomplished. Dr. Kim from the medical center can tell you how Lyra solved the crop crisis. Chief Rodriguez can explain how Nova's security improvements have protected the entire colony. Testimonials from colleagues who share your emotional bias are not reliable evidence," Inspector Collins replied dismissively. "I need to see measurable compliance with established rehabilitation protocols." That evening, after Inspector Collins had left to prepare her report, David found Nova in his laboratory. She was hunched over his computer, her fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. Her markings were pulsing with focused energy. "What are you working on?" David asked softly. Nova didn't look up from the screen. "Escape routes, transport schedules, safe houses in the outer settlements. I won't let them send us to those work camps." David felt his heart break a little. "Nova, we're not giving up yet. I have contacts, people who know what you've accomplished. We can fight this." "You saw how she looked at us," Nova said, her voice tight with controlled emotion, "like we were dangerous animals that needed to be caged. She's not interested in what we've done or who we are. She just wants us to disappear. Then we'll prove her wrong." Nova finally turned to face him, her silver markings flashing with pain and anger. "How? She controls everything. One report from her and we're gone. You'll be lucky if they don't punish you too for being too soft with us." Before David could answer, Lyra appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted, her usual shimmering patterns reduced to faint, sad ripples across her skin. "I can feel your pain," she whispered to Nova. "And your anger, David. It's so strong it makes my chest hurt." David realized that they were all making this harder for Lyra by fighting in front of her. Her empathic nature meant she experienced everyone's emotions as if they were her own. "I'm sorry," David said, moving to sit beside both girls. "We shouldn't be putting you through this stress." "What if I could be different?" Lyra asked in a small voice. "What if I could learn to be stronger, less sensitive? Maybe if I tried harder, to be what she wants." "No," David and Nova said at the same time. "Don't you ever change who you are for someone like her," Nova said fiercely, taking Lyra's hand. "Your sensitivity isn't a weakness. It's what makes you amazing." David nodded, in agreement. "Nova's right. Inspector Collins is wrong about both of you. Your gifts aren't problems to be fixed. They're exactly what makes you special." They sat together in the quiet laboratory, surrounded by the gentle hum of equipment and the soft glow of monitors. Outside, the experimental gardens rustled in, the evening breeze, their healthy growth a testament to what they had accomplished together. "What happens now?" Lyra asked. David looked at these two remarkable beings who had become his family in ways he never expected. Nova with her brilliant mind and fierce loyalty. Lyra with her gentle strength and incredible connection to all living things. The thought of losing them made him feel hollow inside. "Now we prepare for the final inspection tomorrow," David said with determination. "Inspector Collins wants to see compliance and measurable results? Then that's exactly what we'll give her. But we'll do it our way." "What do you mean?" Nova asked. David smiled for the first time all day. "I mean, we're going to show her what real success looks like. Not the kind that comes from forcing people to be something they're not, but the kind that happens when you help them become the best version of who they already are." As they planned for the next day's challenge, David realized that the three of them had already proven something important. They had created a family based on understanding, respect, and love. Whatever Inspector Collins decided, she couldn't take away what they meant to each other. The real question was whether the colonial authority was ready to see that their way of doing things might be better than the old system of control and compliance. Tomorrow would determine not just their future, but possibly the future of how humans and aliens could live together in this colony. The fight for their family was about to begin. The next morning arrived gray and cloudy, matching David's nervous mood as he prepared for what could be their last day together as a family. Inspector Collins had scheduled the final evaluation for 10 o'clock, and this time she wasn't coming, alone. Colonial Administrator Harrison would be joining her, along with a full review board to make the final decision about Lyra and Nova's future. David found both girls in the kitchen, picking at their breakfast without much appetite. Lyra's skin patterns were pale and worried, while Nova sat tense and alert, her silver markings dim with barely controlled anxiety. "Whatever happens today," David said, sitting down with them, "I want you both to know that meeting you has been the best thing that ever happened to me. You've taught me what it really means to be a family." Nova reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You saved us, David. Even if this doesn't work out, you gave us hope when no one else would." "You gave us more than hope," Lyra added softly. "You gave us a home where we could be ourselves." At exactly 10 o'clock, 3 official vehicles pulled up to the facility. Inspector Collins stepped out of the first one, looking as stern as ever. From the second vehicle emerged Administrator Harrison, a tall man with kind eyes but a serious expression. The third vehicle contained Dr. Torres, the Etherian culture expert who had visited earlier, along with several other officials David didn't recognize. But as they approached the house, David noticed something unexpected. Dr. Kim from the medical center was walking up the path from the other direction. Behind her came Chief Rodriguez from security, followed by several other colonists David had worked with over the past weeks. "What's all this?" Inspector Collins demanded, clearly annoyed by the crowd. "These are people who have worked directly with Lyra and Nova," David explained. "I thought it was only fair that their experiences be part of the evaluation." Administrator Harrison nodded approvingly. "That seems reasonable. We want a complete picture of how this placement has worked out." Inspector Collins looked like she wanted to object, but couldn't argue with her superior's decision. They gathered in David's main laboratory, which had been rearranged to accommodate the larger group. Lyra and Nova stood close together, drawing strength from each other's presence. David could see that Lyra was struggling with the intense emotions from so many people in one room, but she was trying her best to stay calm. "Let's begin with the official evaluation," Administrator Harrison said. "Inspector Collins, please present your findings." Inspector Collins opened her tablet and began reading her report in a cold, clinical voice. "After extensive observation, I have determined that subjects L447 and N891 show no meaningful progress toward colonial integration. Subject L447 continues to display excessive emotional sensitivity and refuses to perform standard work tasks. Subject N891 exhibits dangerous independence and aggressive tendencies that make her unsuitable for supervised placement. She continued, for several more minutes painting Lyra and Nova as failures who would never fit into colonial society. David felt his anger rising with every word, but he forced himself to stay quiet until she finished. Furthermore, Inspector Collins concluded, I believe Mr. Chen's emotional attachment to these subjects has compromised his judgment. I recommend immediate transfer to a strict rehabilitation facility where proper discipline can be maintained. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Administrator Harrison spoke. Thank you, Inspector Collins.
Now let's hear from the others who have interacted with these individuals. Dr. Kim stood up first. Administrator Harrison, I need to tell you about something incredible that happened 3 weeks ago. Our colony was facing a serious food crisis
that my entire medical team couldn't solve. Traditional treatments weren't working and we were running out of options. She went on to describe how Lyra's unique abilities had not only identified the problem, but led to a solution that saved the colony's entire food supply. This young woman isn't too sensitive, Dr. Kim said firmly. She's gifted in ways we're only beginning to understand. Chief Rodriguez spoke next about Nova's security improvements. In my 20 years of defense work, I've never seen anyone with such natural strategic thinking. Her recommendations have already prevented multiple security breaches and saved the colony thousands of credits in potential damages. One by one, other colonists shared their experiences. A farmer whose crops had been saved by Lyra's insights. A factory supervisor whose security problems had been solved by Nova's expertise. A teacher whose students had been inspired by visiting the facility and seeing what cooperation between species could accomplish. Inspector Collins grew increasingly frustrated as each testimony contradicted her assessment. These anecdotal reports don't change the fundamental facts, she interrupted. These subjects still fail to meet established compliance standards. Perhaps, said Dr. Torres, standing up slowly, the problem isn't with the subjects but with the standards themselves. She addressed the room with the authority of someone who had spent decades studying alien cultures. In Etherian society, individuals like Lyra and Nova would be considered highly honored. Lyra's empathic abilities would mark her as a natural healer and environmental guardian. Nova's protective instincts and strategic mind would identify her as leadership material. The auction system that labeled them as too soft and too wild completely misunderstood their nature. Dr. Torres continued. They were never broken things that needed to be fixed. They were extraordinary individuals whose gifts were being wasted. Administrator Harrison listened thoughtfully to everything being said. Finally, he stood up to address the room. It seems we have two very different pictures of these individuals. Inspector Collins sees non-compliance with our current system. Everyone else sees valuable contributors to our community. Just as he was about to continue, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Nova's security system was detecting something urgent. Through the windows, they could see colonists running and pointing toward the eastern hills. Seismic activity detected, Nova announced, reading the data from her monitors. Major geological instability about 2 miles from here. It's heading toward the main agricultural zone. The room erupted in concerned voices. This kind of seismic event could destroy the colony's food production and endanger hundreds of lives. How long do we have? Administrator Harrison asked urgently. Nova studied her readings. The main shock will hit the agricultural zone in approximately 20 minutes. We need to evacuate immediately and protect the critical infrastructure. What about containment? Chief Rodriguez asked. Can we minimize the damage? I'm already calculating evacuation routes and emergency protocols, Nova replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. But we need someone who can assess the environmental impact on the crops and soil systems. All eyes turned to Lyra. Despite the chaos and stress around her, she closed her eyes and extended her senses toward the agricultural zone. Her skin patterns shifted into complex spirals of green and brown as she connected with the plant networks across the colony. The main root systems are strong enough to survive if we can redirect the water flow, she said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the emergency. But there's a critical irrigation junction that will fail if the ground shifts more than 3 feet. Working together, Nova and Lyra provided the information needed to coordinate an emergency response that saved both lives and crops. Nova's strategic planning ensured efficient evacuation and resource protection. Lyra's connection to the living systems helped identify which areas could be saved and which needed to be abandoned temporarily. The crisis lasted 4 hours. When it was over, the damage was minimal compared to what it could have been. The agricultural zone was intact, no lives were lost, and the colony's food supply remained secure. As they gathered back in David's laboratory, Administrator Harrison looked at Lyra and Nova with new understanding. "What I witnessed today wasn't just competence," he said slowly. "It was extraordinary leadership under pressure. These young women didn't just follow orders or perform assigned tasks," he continued. "They took initiative, made critical decisions, and potentially saved our entire colony." Inspector Collins tried one more time to object. "But they still don't conform to standard rehabilitation protocols." "Then perhaps," Administrator Harrison said firmly, "it's time we changed our protocols." He turned to David, Lyra, and Nova. "I'm creating a new classification for situations like this. You'll be designated as special contributors to the colony, with full citizenship rights and the freedom to live and work as you choose." The relief in the room was overwhelming. Lyra's patterns burst into brilliant golds and blues, reflecting her joy and gratitude. Nova's silver markings flashed bright with triumph and happiness. 6 months later, David's facility had been expanded into the Interspecies Integration Center, serving as a model for a new approach to alien resettlement. Lyra had become the colony's chief environmental advisor, her gentle wisdom helping balance human expansion with ecological harmony. Nova led the newly formed Interspecies Defense Council. Her protective nature extended to the entire diverse community they had helped create. Other difficult cases were being referred to their center, where David, Lyra, and Nova worked together to help misunderstood aliens find their